Hi everyone, today we are in Sidmouth on the south coast of Devon, and just wait until you see this view. It's just incredible. So off in the distance you can see the cliffs, and you can see the way the light is playing across the different rocks. Over in the distance there are some white rocks, and then as we come nearer, the red sandstone, which is characteristic of this part of the Devon coast. And if you look at the colour of the sea, this is the English Channel, then the sea, which is normally blue, green here, is a mix of amazing colours: purples, reds, oranges, brown, green, blue. And this is due to rockfalls from those red cliffs getting broken up by the water, getting churned up and mixing up this crazy muddy palette of different colours. Pretty good subject for a painting, I think. Alright, so we're back at the studio now. So I'm going to begin outlining this landscape painting, or seascape painting, using a watercolor paint marker. So there are the beginnings of the nearest cliff face. And then we have this sort of second block-like formation after that. And then the cliffs kind of peter out off into the distance. And then we need a horizon line going across here somewhere. So I've deliberately placed the cliffs and the horizon quite high up on the page. But before I go any further, I just need to check my proportions. So let's have a look. So the height of this cliff should be about the same as its width, and it is, so that's good. And then that same height again should take me to about the middle of these cliffs. So the proportions are looking fairly reasonable, so that's okay. And then I need to come down about the same amount again, so around about there. So somewhere around here. And the waterline kind of sweeps round, does something like that. Then there's a spit of dry sand, or drier sand, here. The sand is rather wet in this region. There's a nice reflection here, and then the water over here is kind of lapping in at an angle. The water up here is also coming in waves and ripples. So quite quickly we've been able to just plot out the composition of our painting. The first stage of blocking in for this painting is going to be to block in the sky, and to do that I'm using the interactive acrylics. I've just sprayed the surface of the painting with water. Now you can see the watercolor marker is running, but I don't mind about that. That's not going to be a problem. And what I'm doing is just dragging with a fairly big brush a pale blue across the sky. So I've mixed this up with cerulean blue and titanium white, a little touch of burnt umber just to knock the colour back a bit, make it not too vibrant. And although the watercolour running isn't a problem, I will just pick up most of these big dribbles that I've got. There are probably going to be some more in a minute, but I really don't mind at all. One of the reasons I use the watercolour marker is I know that I can obliterate or move around those marks very easily. So it's nothing is too set in stone at these early stages. Next, using the same brush and a slightly darker version of the same blue, just going to drag my brush across this area of wet sand that's picking up the reflection from the sky. A little darker again for these foreground areas of water. And that's perhaps not dark enough, actually. But while I've got this colour on the brush, I will apply it to these regions. And the great thing about the interactive acrylics is you can really mobilise the paint with a quick spray of the water bottle, so it makes it very flexible medium to use. But I will just darken up that foreground bit with a touch of the near pure Silurian blue. And then for this next region of water, which needs to be much darker and more purple, I'm going to start with a layer of cobalt blue. Well, in fact, I couldn't find the cobalt blue quickly, so I've decided to go with French ultramarine. And I mixed that in with a little bit of this blue, and that's got us somewhere close. So still using the same brush, once again painting onto the wet surface of the paper. Some sweeping horizontal brush strokes to block in this deeper area of water. And that same area of water has quite a purple tinge in parts. So using a smaller brush now, this one's about 1 inch wide, it's a flat brush again. Added some magenta to that same mix of blue I had. And what I did there was I kept the brush at that angle, and as I moved it from right to left, I gradually rotated it, just to change the thickness of the brush stroke a bit. And I'm going to continue with that same colour, having just sprayed these areas with some water in the foreground. And that's going to mix in with the lighter blue. And allow me to just very loosely indicate the pooling of water that's happening in the shallows here. Now this bit's come out a little bit dark, so let's just blend that in with the lighter colour. Can keep that going over here actually as well. That will work quite well. We'll just feather in a little bit on the left too. So I'm going to leave the watery areas for a moment. You can see probably on camera the paper is buckling quite a lot. I'm not worried about that when the paint dries. This paper is really good, this mixed media paper. I'll be able to flatten that out without problem. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave these very distant cliffs as they are, and in fact I may end up doing nothing more to those. We'll see. But I want to work on these two nearer cliff faces. So to begin with, I'm working on this one, and I'm going to come in with a mix of titanium white and yellow ochre. I'm just applying that very thinly over the top of the watercolour marker that was there before. And there is a little bit of blue still in that as well, by the way, a little bit of this blue. Now, continuing with that same mixture, but having added a lot of titanium white and cadmium yellow, I'm just patching in the areas of this foremost cliff that are really catching the light. I'm actually going to use just a touch of that same colour up there on the cliff top, and a little pop of colour on the top edge of that cliff and the top of the face there. Perhaps even a bit on this edge as well. Next I'm going to come in with a reddish brown for the main part of the cliff face. Now this was created by taking that same yellowy colour and adding some cadmium red, and then also some of the blue that I still had on my palette. Now at the moment this reddy brown is a little more brown than red, so I'm going to put this coat on, but I'm going to come back in a moment and make things a little bit redder than they currently are. But while I've got this on the brush, I will just very lightly drag this colour over that area there, and I'll also use it to block in this region of sand as well. Let's just wet the paper again. So I just want a thin layer initially, just to kill the white. So I've mixed in some more of the red and yellow now. And that's producing a colour for the cliff faces, which is a little bit nearer to what they are in reality. And I'm applying the paint very thinly still, and the reason for that is I'm going to be quite happy if some of these runs in the watercolour marker show through. If they don't, I don't mind, but I want to keep some evidence of those for as long as possible. And once again, while I've got that darker colour on the brush, in fact this region here needs to be a lot darker, I now realise. So there's now much more of the cad red and the ultramarine blue in this mixture of paint, and I just sprayed this area with water very lightly again, but just to make the paint flow so that I can very quickly block in this area. And then all we need to do now is treat the tops of these cliff tops, and then the first layer of paint will be pretty much done, and then I'll leave the painting to dry completely before I continue further. So let's get onto these cliff tops by putting down a thin layer of, that's a little bit thick actually, let me just dilute the paint a bit. So we'll put down a thin layer of light green. So this is created with cadmium yellow and celerium blue and titanium white. And while we're up here, let's ruffle the top edge of that cliff, because we've got trees and bushes and things growing up there. And come back to this one and tease out that green splotch I put down. Block in that area too, again with a ruffled top edge. And I've just added a bit of ultramarine blue to that same mixture. Quick spray with the water bottle again. I'm just going to feather in a little bit of a variation in the green. To begin to suggest the presence of, different plant life growing on the hillside and the cliff tops. So, as I said, so far so good. First layer of paint's pretty much down, so it's a nice sunny day today, so I'm going to pop this outside to dry in the sunlight. So such a warm day today that it only took a couple of minutes for the paint to dry. So what I'm about to do next is I've got a rather thicker mixture of paint than I've been using previously. It's mostly titanium white, but I've mixed it in with a little bit of this blue. And I'm going to drag that very, very lightly across the surface of the painting here to begin to suggest some reflections on the wet patch of sand we've got here. And I'm going to use that same technique over here. Picking out highlights on the water. Now, I don't want to overdo this, I'm just trying to hint at the light catching the water and the wet sand. So for now I'm going to leave that treatment as it is. And using a rather thinner brush this time, I'm just going to come in over here on the right. Suggesting some of the waves lapping in here from the right hand side of the painting. Now we've added some highlights, we need to put in some darks now as well. So I'm going to begin with a dark colour down here. And actually that hasn't worked too well on that part, so I may remove that in a moment. It's a little bit darker than I thought it was going to be. But I think that same colour with a little bit of white in just a touch. I think I can use that over here to pick out some of the wet sand. So let's see how that works. Yeah, that's working quite well. I like that. And I'll feather that same colour over the top of some of these areas. And some of the water here needs to be darkened a little bit too. Now I need to sort this area out. So coming back in with a deeper version of that brown, let's just adjust the shape of that spit of sand, which actually, now that I look at it, is much closer to the reality than the version I had. And we can introduce some variation of colour and texture across the sand here. Now that same colour I'm going to apply very lightly back here. And I'll be coming back to that little section in just a bit. Now I've mixed up a lighter orange and I want to introduce some of this into the water over here. Not too much, but just a hint. I want a little strip of orangey colour here coming into the water. And then after that I'm going to put a little band of green off in the distance as well. So that's working quite well. And I've just added a little bit of titanium white to that same colour. Now that same colour I'm actually going to use on the face of the cliff here to brighten it up a little bit. And we'll use some of that down here too. And I think I'm even going to include a little bit of that in the foreground. I quite like the orange placed in different positions around the painting to help the eye bounce around the frame. That seems to be working quite well. But I need to brighten up these highlights on the cliff face next. Sorry about that, I just realised I zoomed in a bit to hopefully show you some more of this detail. But in doing that, I forgot to zoom out when I put some stuff down here. So I hope you're able to see most of that. But I've hopefully got the entire painting in frame now. And so, as I said, I'm just going to brighten up these highlights on the cliff face. So this is the same mix of orange as before, but with more cadmium yellow and more titanium white in. And as you can probably tell, I haven't mixed that colour too thoroughly, so I'm getting some variation in the colour that I put down on the page. So sometimes there are little areas of pure white, other times it's pure orange, other times pure yellow. And I think I'm actually going to use that same colour, but a little more sparingly for this distant cliff face here, or more distant cliff face. And then I can do the same thing again that little strip of beach along there, and then I'll grab a bit more white and put in the distant shoreline there. Now as we get closer, I'm using the same colour again, but this time one edge of my brush has got pure red on, and one edge of the brush, one corner, has got pure burnt umber on. So that's kind of creating this, random mix of colours here. And it's not truly representative of what's there, but it does provide an interesting contrast with the simpler, more distant beach. So I'm going to use that same one here to pop in, that same colour here, to begin to pop in a couple of rocky outcrops. And then with a lot more burnt umber on the brush, just putting in some deeper shadows on the beach there. Next up, let's go back to our greens. So I've created a light green with titanium white, cadmium yellow and cerulean blue. And just popping in a few loose highlights where the sunlight is catching the greenery of the cliff tops. And now for the shadow areas, I'm actually going to come in with a little bit of neat ultramarine blue. And I'm just feathering that on very lightly, kind of a dry brush technique, to just select a few shadow regions on the cliff edge. And I'll very, very lightly do the same thing on the side of that cliff face. And we'll keep that colour theme going as well, with a line down the beach and some of the shadows here on those rocky outcrops. Now, my current thinking for this painting is that I think when I frame it, I'm more or less going to lose most of this foreground area below my hand. I think I'm going to make it more panoramic and just have a little bit of this piece of sand showing. So for that reason, I'm not going to worry too much about this stuff anymore. I'm going to put that little band of green in that I mentioned. I have decided to leave these cliffs exactly as they are. Pretty happy with this area. This area is fairly happy. I do need to define the shoreline a little better and the ripples a little more clearly, so I'll do that in a second. And then I'm going to add some people here in the foreground with their reflections on the wet sand to give the painting a sense of scale. So this green is a slightly lighter version and paler version of the one I used for the foliage. And I want to add just a couple of touches of pure yellow, just a couple here and there on the cliff top. And the pale orange I used for the highlights on the cliffs, I'm going to use some of that colour on the rocks as well. Perhaps a little burst there. And then, as I said, I need to really put some sense of rippling water in here. So to do that, I've mixed up a deep purple with ultramarine blue and cad red and magenta. And I'm using the edge of my flat 1/2 inch brush to lightly drag that deep colour across the page. And although I'm going to lose most of this area, I am just going to use that in here. And I'm actually going to use a watered down version of that same colour over here. And just darken this area a little bit. And that's going to allow me to pull out some selective highlights in just a moment. So let's see what happens in just a tick. And the bottoms of these rocky outcrops need to be in much, much darker shadow. There we go. And in fact, that same colour I used here, I'm going to use to fill in some of the little panels that I've effectively, well, not panels so much I guess, but little shapes I created when I put those dark outlines on. So we'll just do a couple. And now I'm going to come in with some pure white, a little burst of yellow in. And I'm doing this to suggest the movement of the water, the waves lapping in. So I'm not trying to draw the waves as such, but I want to suggest their presence. Let's pick up a little bit of magenta in with the white. So it's nice to give your highlights a variety of colour. Maybe just go a little wild with the brush here and there. And then we could almost, just while the paint is fading from the brush, just put in a little more subtle indication of white water off in the distance as well. So I think we're almost there now. I just want to include the people here on this section. Actually, before I do that, I do want to just pull out that little highlight I mentioned in here. And I might even add a little bit of that there. So okay, now it's time for the people, I think. And to do that, I think we'll start as we began. So I'm going back to my watercolor marker here, and I'm not going to do too many of these, but I do want a sense of scale in the painting. So what I'm going to do is just, using the fine nib, just pop in some simple silhouettes. That I can add to in just a moment, and I can also start to indicate a little bit of a reflection there. I think, to be honest, those three will probably do. I'm tempted, although I am tempted to put a couple here. Perhaps I'll put a couple more down here. Let's make these guys ever so slightly bigger. That works quite well, I think, but at the moment these silhouettes are completely monotone, so I do need to add just some subtle hints of colour here and there. So going in with a small brush now, I'll give this person on the right a pale top and lighten their reflection correspondingly. then let's have a touch of pale red. Well, not pale red actually, quite bright red on the top here of this chap. And then I'll give him a rather muddier red reflection. Make this reflection pale as well. And we'll just add in a little touch of pale flesh colour. I mean, literally just a dot here and there, you know, to suggest that these are people. But I think for the moment we'll call that one finished. But what I do want to do is show you how I would frame the painting, because it's going to make quite a difference to this particular piece of work. I could also do with tidying up this horizon line a little bit as well. But yes, for the most part, that's that one done. Now, just before we finish, I wanted to show you the finished painting, or rather 3 different versions of that, on the website. So let me just type in Sidmouth in the keyword search here, and that will bring up all 3 of the images. So what I've done is I've taken the original painting and I have, here we go, I have framed it in 3 different ways. So let me just zoom in a little bit for you. There we go. So you can see that with this one, this is what I mentioned earlier in the video. I kind of trimmed off everything below where I had my hand. If you remember a few minutes ago, I cut out a lot of the foreground. So that gives a nice panoramic view. We'll have a closer look at that one in a moment. But then I also did 2 other versions. The first is pretty much a square aspect ratio, and the reason I decided in retrospect to include some of this foreground stuff was I really liked this little window of wet sand here, this little almost semicircle in the bottom right hand corner. I really feel that adds something to the composition. And then finally I did a tall and narrow version that you can see here on the right. And all 3 of these I really like. So one of the great things, of course, with digital technology is you can create one painting but come up with 3 or more different versions to offer as prints. So let me click into this one. I just want to show you something really cool you can do here. So I've mentioned this first bit on previous videos, but you can move the cursor around and then say I want to look in close-up at this part, click, and it will load the full resolution preview of the image. So you can really see in close detail the brushwork that I've used and the textures involved. Look at all the little lumps of paint you've got here. But then in addition to that, if you want to see how something would look on your wall, or how it would look framed, for example, I can say, well, okay, I'll go for a fairly big framed print. I can click here, and then I can see how that would look in relationship to a piece of furniture, or another piece of furniture. Or I can get a close-up look. There's my little signature there of the corner of the frame. And again, there are objects here, so you get a sense of scale. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. So I hope you really enjoyed this one. Thanks very much for watching. If you're new here, please remember to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. But in the meantime, I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of The Sunday Art Show. Thanks again for watching.